How do you pray for a person who doesn't love Jesus? How do you pray for a person who's a Christian? How do you pray for someone whose soul is in danger of spending eternity in hell away from God? This is such an important subject. I gave a whole chapter in my book, Pray Big, to talking about it. And I take lessons from the life of Jesus and how he ministered to people who were dead. Funny thing about Christ, he'd get around dead people and they wind up being alive. Well, Ephesians chapter 2 tells us that someone without Christ isn't just physically in trouble, they're spiritually dead. Their souls are dead. And so really, when you're praying for an unbeliever to become a Christian, you're praying for God to take an unregenerate dead soul and make it alive. So in Pray Big, I direct us to John chapter 11, where Christ went to Lazarus' tomb and raised that dead man from the dead and brought him back to life. And we draw lessons about how to pray for someone who doesn't know Christ, that God might bring them to life as well. You pray for things like that God might have compassion on them, because when Jesus showed up there at Lazarus' tomb, he was moved with compassion. I also teach you to never, ever, ever stop praying. Even though Christ was 4 days late and Lazarus had been dead for a couple of days and the Jews believed he couldn't be resurrected anymore, Christ still showed up and brought Lazarus back from the dead. I teach you to pray that Christ will remove the barriers from an unbeliever's life. Remember, he had the grave clothes taken off of Lazarus? There are things that keep unbelieving people from knowing Christ. We don't pray against those kind of things. But the most important thing you can pray for an unbeliever is that Christ would call them by name. Remember, Christ stood at that tomb and said, Lazarus, come out. The old joke is if he just said, come out, all the dead people in Bethany would have gotten up and risen from the dead. So he was very specific. He said, Lazarus, come out. When you're praying for your unbelieving neighbor or friend or husband or father or whatever he or she is, say, God, I'm asking you to call them by name. That you'll say Will or Mary or Joseph or Thomas into their heart and call them out, because they'll hear them. Recently, we had a video project in our church. And so we hired a videographer from the outside to come and shoot this kind of documentary in our church. Turned out the videography that we liked the most and that we thought had the best opportunity to help us was an agnostic, a young woman who didn't believe in God and wasn't sure she could know God. We hired her anyway. And part of the responsibilities of this shooting was to come to our church and videotape our services. By the way, that's a great way to get an agnostic into church. Pay them. So she started coming to our church, and I'll never forget what happened recently. We had a service where God was there. An amazing thing happened. This unbelieving woman walked up to me after church. She had tears in her eyes, and she said to me, Will, I don't believe in your God, but I felt him here today. Well, you know what happened? We've been praying for that girl. We've been praying for God to make himself real to her. We've been praying that God would call her by name and show himself to her. And he did. And that young lady had her life profoundly changed. So who are you praying for that doesn't know Christ? Start praying that God will show up where they are, that he'll love them, that he'll have compassion for them, that he'll set them free from what binds them, and that most importantly, he'll call them by name. Because when God speaks into the heart of an unbelieving person, they have to hear him. They can say no, but they have to hear him. Start praying big for unbelievers, because God wants to set them free.